Episode 2: The Letters of Fear. It was the summer of 1969, and California was still reeling from the horrific double murder on Lake Herman Road and the attack at Blue Rock Springs. The Bay Area lived in fear, wondering if the mysterious figure who called himself the Zodiac would ever strike again. And then, just as the panic began to fade, the killer made sure the world hadn't forgotten him. Not with bullets this time, but with words. The Zodiac began writing letters. Taunting letters. Terrifying letters. Envelopes addressed to newspapers sealed with menace, filled with boasts of murder, demands for recognition, and threats that sent an entire region into panic. In his first communication, the Zodiac demanded that his letters be published on the front page of San Francisco's leading newspapers. Inside, he included a cryptogram, a coded puzzle, that he claimed contained his identity. The letters described in chilling detail the murders of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, and Darlene Ferrin. Details that only the killer would know. The Bay Area press complied, fearing that if they didn't, more lives would be lost. And as the ink dried on those pages, the public read the words of a killer who had no intention of stopping. The cryptogram, now known as the 408 cipher, was solved just days later by a schoolteacher and his wife. But the solution was chilling. The killer revealed no name, only a manifesto of his desires: to kill for pleasure, to collect slaves for the afterlife, and to continue his reign of terror until he was stopped. It was unlike anything America had ever seen. A murderer who didn't hide in the shadows, but instead craved the spotlight, relishing the fear he could create with a pen as much as with a gun. The fear was real. People locked their doors earlier at night. Couples avoided lovers' lanes. Parents warned their children about strangers. The Zodiac was no longer just a killer. He was a phantom, an unseen presence in the Bay Area that haunted every quiet street, every dark corner, and every lonely road. On September 27, 1969, that fear became reality once again. That evening, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, two college students, decided to spend a quiet afternoon at Lake Berryessa, a scenic spot in Napa County. They laid out a blanket, enjoyed some food, and talked about their plans for the future. It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Cecilia noticed something unusual. A man was approaching them from a distance. At first, it seemed harmless, but as he drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary stranger. The figure wore a strange hood, fashioned like an executioner's mask. On his chest, a white circle with a crosshair symbol, the now feared insignia of the Zodiac killer. In his hand, he carried a gun. Brian tried to remain calm. The man said he wanted their car, claiming he had escaped from prison and needed to get away. He assured them he wouldn't hurt them if they cooperated. But the tone of his voice told another story. The stranger pulled out lengths of rope, ordering Cecilia to tie Brian's hands behind his back. Then he bound Cecilia as well. Once both were restrained, the truth of his intentions became terrifyingly clear. He drew a long knife and began to stab them. Brian was stabbed 6 times. Cecilia, 10. The attack was frenzied, brutal, and merciless. When it was over, the killer walked away, leaving the young couple bleeding on the ground. Miraculously, Brian survived. Cecilia did not, but the killer wasn't finished. Less than an hour later, a phone call came into the Napa County Sheriff's Office. The voice on the other end was calm, cold, almost casual. "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder," the caller said. He gave precise directions to the crime scene, and then he hung up. The phone booth where the call was made was quickly located, just blocks from the police station. But the fingerprints left behind were smudged, useless. The Zodiac had once again slipped away. At the crime scene, officers found something else. On the side of Brian's car, scrawled in black marker, was the Zodiac's symbol. Beneath it, the dates of his previous attacks. And under that, the chilling note, by knife. The killer was keeping score. As news of the Lake Berryessa attack spread, the Bay Area was gripped with fear once more. The Zodiac had proven he could strike in broad daylight, in a place where no one thought they'd ever encounter a killer. He wasn't hiding, he was hunting. Just 2 weeks later, the Zodiac would strike again. On the night of October 11, 1969, Paul Stine, a San Francisco cab driver, picked up a fare near Union Square. The passenger was described as a white male, 35 to 45 years old, stocky build, with a crew cut. The cab made its way toward Presidio Heights, one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. At 9:58 p.m., the cab stopped at the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets. Neighbors heard a single gunshot. When they looked out their windows, they saw a man leaning over the driver, wiping down the vehicle, tearing away part of Stine's shirt. The witnesses, 3 teenagers, quickly called the police, describing the man they had just seen. Officers Donald Falk and Eric Zelms were patrolling nearby when they spotted a man walking calmly along the street, not far from the crime scene. But here, fate dealt a cruel blow. The initial radio description of the suspect had incorrectly listed him as a black male. The officers drove past the man they had seen, unknowingly letting the Zodiac walk free. The next day, the San Francisco Chronicle received yet another letter. Inside was a piece of Paul Stine's bloodied shirt. There was no denying it. The Zodiac himself had committed the murder in the heart of San Francisco. In his letter, the Zodiac mocked police for letting him escape. He bragged about how easily he had walked away from the scene, blending into the night as though he belonged there. He threatened to attack schoolchildren, promising to pick them off as they got off buses. The city was in shock. Fear had reached a fever pitch. Parents began escorting their children to school. Bus routes were changed. San Francisco was paralyzed with terror. Paul Stine's murder was unlike any of the Zodiac's previous attacks. It wasn't in a secluded spot. It wasn't lovers in a car. It was a random, calculated execution in a wealthy neighborhood, in front of witnesses. It proved that the Zodiac could strike anyone, anywhere, and there was little anyone could do to stop him. The murders of Brian Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard, followed by the brazen killing of Paul Stine, cemented the Zodiac's legacy as one of America's most terrifying killers. With each letter, each threat, and each taunt, he controlled the city with fear. And he wasn't finished. For the police, the question remained: who was the man behind the mask? And how many more would die before he was caught? The Zodiac was no longer just a killer. He was an obsession, an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. His words, his symbols, his games of cat and mouse with the press and police ensured that his shadow lingered over the Bay Area like a storm cloud that would never clear. And as his letters grew darker and more threatening, it became clear that the Zodiac was playing a long game, one in which the rules were his, and the lives of innocents were his pawns.